My name is Anica, and I'm the gallery director for Method in Delhi. We've just opened a show called Slow Rot, and the show essentially excavates the idea of grotesque. It's embedded a bit in satire, where when most people do come to a gallery, they look for art, they look for beauty, but that's not the job of the artist. The artist essentially is an archiver, the artist is a truth teller, and in many ways, the artist is a recorder of the contemporary times that we live in. I was fascinated by the idea of some of South Asia's most reputed confessional poets like Kamala Das and other writers like Manto, Chuktai, and even international writers like Charles Bukowski, who gave a perspective to life that felt more real and more about the actual social realities of life. The show is not something that is wildly out there, but really does look at the idea of grotesques from our personal experiences. All of these artists look like confessional artists who are recording and decoding shared traumas that we as a society faced in today's times. Behind me is Riya Chandwani's work. Riya Chandwani comes from a Sindhi family and looks at the idea and the memory of partition from the memories of her family. Some of those memories were suppressed and repressed for a long period of time because it was too soon to talk about them. But the current generation of artists is being able to bring out the shared community history of partition, which really reveals the visuals of what writers like Sadat Hassan Manto wrote in their short stories, which today take us back to the grim reality of how the largest migration in human history left us. Right next to me is a work by Sajid Wajid's Shaikh, a work that is actually a baby's crib shaped in the form of a coffin, which doesn't need much explanation about how the artist's reaction to the current times, the current political times that we live in. What's interesting about Sajid's work in this particular sculpture and in these two relief sculptures that we're showing here is that they are made in gunmetal, in oxidized gunmetal, and this entire body of work is essentially embedded in violence. And it talks about archaeology of the future. So if you were to find these reliefs where he has created these characters who hold knives and an arrow sign, which does show that this is either contemporary now or the future. When you do find these materials there, it leaves no doubt in your mind when you explore the material that it is in many ways the archaeology of violence that we are facing right now. Sandwiched between Sajid's work is a work by Imran Ahamed, an artist who showed this particular work at the Students' Biennale, at the Kochi Biennale that just went by. And this work, in many ways, looks at how society chooses to carry on while living with ghosts of the past. In the canvas, you see a common sight where people are lounging about, indulging in everyday mundane activities. But what you see floating in the foreground and in the background are transparent spirits that are sort of rising and floating about, which really recalls the ghosts of our reality that we choose to live with. And right behind, facing this work, is another work by the same artist that looks at an old lady sitting alone, holding a knife in a room that has been locked shut on every exit that is there, three over here, with a lonesome chair and tumbled up vessels. It really does represent that lady left to die in an old age home. And it is a reality that age kind of festers on us at some point. But But this lady who's been through her entire life, uh, who's just left there waiting, really makes us think about uh, how we choose to treat people around us. Behind that is a young artist, Tithi Das, who comes from Baroda. And what you do see is a blatant work of a mother in complete surrender, her hands up, a child suckling at her breasts, but looking at the viewer in a very confrontational stare, almost possessive, that she's mine. The surrender in the mother's arms, yet the softness in the mother's eyes is a reality that so many women sort of go through, where they try and figure out, who am I, who do I belong to, and even ask the question, do I even belong to myself? Right next to that is a print by the same artist that shows a recently cut up stomach of a mother after having delivered a child. Aditya Dhabhai is an artist who works across canvases and sculpture. This particular series is really embedded in so many theories about the unspoken truth, the iconography of the tongue, whether it's in the mouth or flying out almost snakishly or in a reptilian way, or is even in the head, speaks about those unspoken truths about life. But if you look at these heads, they look rather outlandish and inspired from animals that pretty much surround us in our daily life, like the house lizard, for example. These heads don't directly talk about the grotesqueness in our society, but lie more deeply in the imagination of our mind that does not have a place in common society right now, but has an efflorescence when we are left alone with our thoughts. And what are those alter personalities that we would like to associate with? Similarly, another artist, Priyesh, whose two works out here truly recount popular culture. One of the most iconic images from Indian advertising, the Parle Ji girl, here somehow seems to be melting, with her hands forming almost in a way that belongs perhaps in a swamp. And right next to her is a lady who looks like the ideal woman, a woman who is so beautiful and dressed in the way of that South Asian woman from our imaginations, but has an octopus that seems to be squeezing her face out while she's having her everyday cup of tea. Um, Other two works by Priyesh, who looks at popular culture in a very direct way. For example, this particular work of a blow up doll really shows how the standards of beauty these days are exerted upon women. With the perfect shape of the body, somehow the artist sees a certain depth in grotesqueness in her choices. And behind me is a show that is behind me is a work that is called Telerubbies, and it obviously draws from the popular TV show that little children would watch, Teletubbies. But what happens after hours? You see, behind the sun has set, and the Teletubbies have chosen to entertain themselves by opening up the television for their own personal pleasure. And I think voyeurism in society has been deemed as a negative emotion. But perhaps through Priyesh's works, one is realizing that someone who indulges in a noble cause of working with children all day, at the end of the day, is also their age. Mitali Das's works are something that we encountered when we opened up this gallery in Delhi and showed her works in our first show, Fresh Produce. And some of these works were part of that show. And what fascinated me and why we invited her to be part of this show, because of the universal questioning that especially women, go through with regards to their bodies. For example, this particular work, to me, is around the constant thought in a woman's head when she's talking to people and they don't seem to be looking at her eyes while talking to her. And she wants to tell them, you know what, my eyes are up here. But in this work, she's actually put her eyes to the place where the people do want to stare, which really, kind of ties together all these other canvases where the body uh, could be given a certain prescription, but it has its own organic nature. And that organic nature is better shown here, where the back of this beautiful girl's neck has somewhat of a skin abrasion. One could call it a boil. Um, uh, but what's growing out of it, alongside strands of hair, is a beautiful flowering plant. And in so many ways, that calls back so simply with the female body as a fertile ground for giving life, no matter what state it is in. Um, and then we have Dhruvi's work over here, essentially also looking at the voyeurism of society. And clearly, the characters in her work aren't completely human, but aren't completely outlandish as well, with very familiar form, but exaggerated forms. They indulge in activities that behind closed doors cannot be judged. A beautiful piece of sculpture is also part of this show. And finally, we have Revant Dasgupta, whose extremely bold post impressionistic lines, really through their color, their form, and their figuration, take out the violence of a person while in chaotic momentum, in a demanding space like a city. One of the last pieces of ceramic that we have shown in this particular show is this piece by artist Milan Sharma, and the piece is called Feminine Energy. And I think not every piece needs an explanation as to why feminine energy is depicted in this way. But sometimes you just see how the feminine energy, which so most often is associated with the divine, is associated with motherhood, is associated with nurturing, can also be one of the most fearsome energies, wilder energies, natural energies emerging from the earth that cannot be controlled beyond a point of time.